So we can start off with the first question, which is, can you briefly introduce yourself and your background in renewable energy systems and projects to our audience?
Sure. I graduated as an engineer, worked as an engineer for a public utility for a couple of years, and then decided I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. I went back to graduate school, then I taught in high school for 10 years. 1969, I started an environmental education program before there were such things. It was primarily an effort to get students out of the classroom and doing real world research on environmental issues. And I went to Washington University, where I was the director of an interdisciplinary program in environment science and policy, and I became associated with Environment Magazine, of which I'm now one of several executive editors. Environment covers a wide variety of environmental issues, including renewable energy, sustainable energy, and increasingly now also what we are calling the just transition, that is involving other people than those who have been traditionally involved in this: minorities, marginalized people, ethnic minorities, and so forth. Um, as I said, I'm an engineer, and I've studied a great deal about, and I've written in a variety of publications about the possibilities of renewable and sustainable energy, including, in my view, nuclear power, which is pretty controversial among a number of people, as Sarah and Sandy will attest. So that's who I am.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really cool that you started one of the first environmental education programs. That's so awesome.
I should also say I ran two nonprofit organizations for 35 years.
Oh, wow. Which nonprofits were those?
Well, one was a thing called the Scientist Institute for Public Information, which was a bridge between the scientific community and the media, journalists. We ran a referral service where journalists could call us and we'd put them in touch with scientists and engineers and so forth who could answer their questions. And in that regard, as I tell my class all the time, I hired you as graduates. I hired young people as graduates, and I didn't care what you know. I just cared what skills you had: talking, writing, critical thinking, ability to look things up in research capacities, and so forth. And the second one was a thing called the Gene Media Forum, which is the same issue but focused on genetics, the ethics and science of genetics.
That's really cool. Thank you so much for that context. Um, you mentioned the just transition. So what are the core principles of a just energy transition and who gets to define them?
Well, I think we need more than a just energy transition, because if you look at what we need to do, it really requires a profound change in the economy. There are so many built-in structures that support fossil fuel use, and we have to dismantle those laws, those traditions, those even institutions. And while we're doing that, we have a chance to redo the economy so that it does not have the same level of income inequality. Not that everybody should earn the same thing, but we certainly need to reduce the level of inequality that exists, and certainly include marginalized groups, poor people, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, and so forth, in that tradition. In that transition. So I think we can't stop just at energy. We have to look at the whole picture, because we have to look at the whole picture to do energy anyway. It's not going to happen by its own. Renewables are not enough. We need changes in the infrastructure. We need changes in policy. We need things like mass transportation. We need a lot of things that go beyond energy if we're really going to reach net zero emission economy. So we have to pay attention to these other things as well. If if people, I mean, we've already seen an example of this with the UAW voting against electric cars. Now, that's in their interest because electric cars take fewer workers to produce, so they're afraid that their membership is going to go down. Until we have a plan that includes what to do with the people we are throwing out of work, including the coal miners in Appalachia. I mean, we want to leave coal in the ground. So how are we going to do that? If we don't offer the miners an adequate path to a good future, and the same thing with minorities. If we do not include them in the work that we are doing, they're not going to support us. So we need a whole society effort. Everybody has to be convinced that this is to their benefit. And I think we made a mistake in the environmental community, and I include myself in that, by preaching doom and gloom. That's not going to win people over. What we need to present is a future that is much better than the one we have now. For example, if I get in a bus, I live on 94th Street in Columbus Avenue. If I get in a bus and it actually is able to take me to where I want to go in a reasonable amount of time, isn't that better? So there are lots of things that are going to be true of this future world that we are trying to construct. That's a lot better than the one we have now. That's what we have to present. People will vote on hope, not on despair.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in this field there is so much doom and gloom. I remember I studied environmental science and sustainability in college, and one of my friends dropped out of the major because he's like, I can't handle
It's,
I can't handle it.
what college was this?
At Cornell University.
Cornell. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so I always think about him as like
Right,
just
right, right,
yeah,
right.
it's tough, and we need people who are willing to persevere even though the solutions are tough and the issues are great, but we definitely need people to persevere. So that's really great. Thank you for that answer. Um, so our next question is, what methodologies can one use for assessing the feasibility and justice implications of energy transition projects?
Well, that's a good question. I think we need to get a lot of people involved in the discussion of this and the implementation of it. I don't know of any particular methodology that would be useful, except getting people to be involved and getting their opinions. We know that when science, for example, reaches out to the general public and the general population, many times there are answers, there are questions which are asked, which the scientists didn't think of asking on their own. So, and we don't have adequate structures at the moment for that. I mean, we have a political process, but many people feel disabused by the political process and don't feel involved. So we need local councils, we need local groups of people, and here the environmental community can organizations can be very important in convening small, medium-sized groups of people to discuss what the issues are and how we can implement them.
Great. Yeah, I think it's really important to try to get people's input and provide local councils in order to have a forum for people's opinions and things that the scientists may not
I
realize.
think I think institutions of higher education, certainly including the New School, can play a role in convening discussion groups and convening outreach. The New School does a pretty good job of that. When I first came to New York, I took adult education classes at the New School. That was where you got an education. You also met girls, so that was that was a that was a side benefit.
Amazing. Uh, um, yeah. I think that the new school and universities are like uniquely positioned to
Absolutely,
be
absolutely.
leaders in the space, and no matter who
Right.
is in office, They're really centered on being innovative and on like just putting
Yep,
your money where your mouth is in terms of like
yep,
avoiding greenwashing and actually doing the things that we need to do
absolutely. Yep,
for,
yep.
yeah, sustainability. Um, so many argue that renewables alone cannot achieve a truly just transition. What are the key blind spots in dominant renewable energy strategies, and what alternatives should we consider?
Well, I think technology is important. I'm an engineer, so I believe in technology, and I think that the fact that the cheapest way to produce electricity at this point is by solar photovoltaic panels. That's a very big deal, and that will really add to the possibilities of success. But if you look at the numbers, we currently use 94 quads, that is 94 billion BTUs of energy to fuel our economy. There's no way, even at full tilt, if the renewable energy sources available in the United States, and true around the world, but let's focus on the United States, can do that. So, number one, I think we need to add nuclear power to the mix. Number two, we need to learn what we do using less energy. McKinley and Company, which is a major consulting firm, just published a report saying that the previous lockstep nature of the connection between energy use and the economy is broken. It used to be if you had a 2% increase in GP in the economy, you had a 2% growth in energy. So that's broken. On the other hand, if you look carefully, with the advent of artificial intelligence, which is growing there was a piece in the New York Times today about how China is making cheap vehicles because of its use of robotics fueled by artificial intelligence. That's growing. That takes electricity. So we are facing a real increase in the amount of electricity that is demanded by the economy. So renewables are just not going to be able to do it all. And what is necessary is a really significant change in the way we transport goods, for example, from one place to another. I mean, it's interesting. My grandson decided that he wanted to visit a friend of his who had moved to um, New Orleans. So he doesn't like flying. So he took the train. Well, I mean, come on, took 48 hours by train. That's not sustainable. That's not necessary. I don't know if you've been to Japan or even Europe and taken the fast trains. I mean, they're unbelievable. So that's the kind of thing that we need to think about very seriously, because the current path is, as we all know, is unsustainable. The question is how we make it sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about, this is kind of an aside from the questions that we had, but what do you think about concepts of like degrowth and transition frameworks like that? Like, do you think that's realistic in terms
Yes,
of,
I do. I think that one of the things, and we're going to talk about it in the class in a little bit, is this thing called the circular economy. So that, for example, there is sulfur in coal. So when you burn the coal, it produces this thing called sulfur dioxide, which is a noxious, nasty chemical. So the sulfur is taken out of the coal in many plants. Well, sulfur is also used as a very important industrial chemical because sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4, is a very important part of steel making, for example. So it turns out that exactly the same amount of sulfur that is taken out of coal is that which is used in the process of making sulfuric acid. But we don't use it that way. We mine sulfur from the ground. There's no need to do that. So that if we can develop an economy where the waste product of one process is the feed product of another process, then we will have done a number of things. We will have reduced the waste that that impacts on the environment. We will use less energy. We will reduce the environmental impact of mining things like sulfur. So we've got to start thinking about that kind of project. Not going to be easy. There's actually some time ago there was a section in the old Bell Laboratories, called Industrial Ecology, which did exactly that, which looked at the waste products of one thing and figured out how they could be used in another. It's not going to be easy. We're going to have to change a lot of the processes, but that is certainly possible. And right now, we measure success by how much the GDP grows. We have to stop that. We have to look at, as you say, a zero growth economy. Again, it's not going to be easy. None of these things are going to be easy, but they can be done and they should be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you brought up about circular economies, especially as related to mining, I didn't know that about sulfur, that
No,
waste
no,
product
no.
could be
Very
used.
few people know it. It's not. I mean, that's part
Yeah.
of the problem. People don't know this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know mining is such a big issue related to the increase in renewables. And I think it was Alexander Dunlap who did a study on the percentage. I'm gonna botch the percentage, but I think it's like if we make a full transition to renewables, it'll increase the rare earth minerals that need to be mined by like 60% or
Oh
something.
yeah, right. No, no, the geopolitics of this are terribly important because the materials, cobalt, selenium, uh, uh, that are needed for lithium, that are needed for the just transition, because those materials make much stronger magnets than the steel we use now. That's very important for the efficiency of electric vehicles, for example. They occur in some countries that we do not relate well with, as well as those countries have few environmental protections. So the mining of those minerals is quite profoundly important. They're called rare earth. They're not rare, they're just difficult to get in pure form. They exist combined with a bunch of other things. And one of the leaders in the processing of those things is China.
Mm.
Well, we're not exactly on friendly relationships with China at the moment. And there are many, many reasons why we need to be friendlier to China. My wife and I have gone several times to a thing called the Chautauqua Institute, which is outside of Buffalo, New York, which is a very interesting place. And the sessions were of former Foreign Service officers. As a result of my work with the nonprofit, I got to know the Foreign Service pretty well. In any event, these Foreign Service people, differing opinions on a variety of things, were unanimous in thinking that we are totally mishandling our relationships with China. China wants to be seen as a player on the big field. And a very big aspect of their policies are saving face. That's why Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was such a disaster. I mean, we just need to learn how to relate, particularly with China, but with other countries as well. It's just they are critically important. They produce solar cells much more efficiently than we do, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of work to be done. You have a big job ahead of you, you young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such an important concern with China and how that relationship is being handled because like it or not, we are incredibly dependent on China. So
Oh, we ever.
yeah.
Right, 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 right.
And no amount of tariffs is really gonna
Oh, well, yeah, well, another story. I mean, among the things that is necessary to be done is to get involved in the political process so that climate change becomes a winnable election stance rather than negative one, because we certainly need a government in power, both in Congress and in the executive branch, that will promote some of the policies that need to be done. I mean, in some cases, the government is essential. I mean, the government has played a really interesting, sometimes unseen and unknown role. For example, the military supported a great deal of work and purchase of solar cells. Why? Because in far-flung bases in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, if you transport oil by tanker to those places, those tankers are in trouble. They get bombed, they get attacked. So it paid the government to pay extra to use solar energy to fuel the site. Well, the large purchase of those solar cells at that point, quite expensive, drove the price down. So it was government action in part that drove the price of solar cells down. The government can play a really important role in this whole process, but it has to decide to do that. And we have to elect people that will decide to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of our readings have touched on how the military is a big adapter of renewable energy, but doesn't
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
to,
Right.
yeah, doesn't like to advertise
In
that.
one of the most interesting and effective reports came out of this thing called CNA, which is used to be called the Center for Naval Analysis. It's a totally Defense Department supported. Now, I'm basically a pacifist. I think the military has been used in a lot of cases that I disagree with. Uh, but I have a good deal of respect for some of the activities that the military engages in.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so the next question that we have is related to renewable energy. How do current renewable energy projects, especially wind and solar, risk replicating the same extractive centralized systems that characterize the fossil fuel era?
That's a very key question and a very important one, and I'm glad you're focusing on it because yes, we run the risk of repeating mistakes and um, concentrating power in several large corporations. I don't have any easy answers to that, except number one, to be aware of that issue. Number two, again, the government can play a role by giving contracts to some small companies to spread the wealth, to make sure that not just one corporation gets the benefit of the government. Tax breaks that are given to every industry, small or large, would be a great help. And again, people involvement. I mean, I think the environmental organizations can play a really important role in making sure that the policies of the federal government and even the state governments don't favor large corporations, that they spread the wealth and make sure that there are, because there are many such companies in existence at the moment. Um, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that antitrust legislation can be used in some cases to avoid the large corporations from buying up the smaller companies, which is one of the things that happen. But that's a really important question.
Yeah, I do think antitrust legislation is so important. I think oftentimes overlooked these days.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Right. These days, well, that's certainly true.
Yeah, I feel like
Very true.
it's a problem across many industries and renewable energy slash the green economy is no different.
Yep. Right. Right.
Um, from a systems perspective, what are the major strengths and limitations of wind and solar, particularly regarding energy equity, storage, and long-term sustainability? And then, second question, how compatible are large-scale wind and solar projects with the goals of community control and democratic governance?
Again, very good question because we need a mix. I mean, we do need some large solar farms. We do need large areas taken up with solar cells. However, solar energy by its very nature solar cells is distributed. You can put them anywhere. You can put them on top of garages. You can put them on top of parking spaces with support. I mean, many buildings are not built to withstand the weight of the solar panel on the top, and that's where the government can come in, can give subsidies for that. The city of Berkeley gives a tax credit for those people who have residents who want to put solar panels on their roof so that they can actually get some financial support to do that. That has to happen around the country. I mean, so Berkeley is doing it as a city. But we need federal and state legislation to do the same thing because that then distributes the generating capacity, and also, it allows homeowners to sometimes sell their electricity back to the electric utility that is governing the transmission wires. The law requires them to accept that, but we need a better electric grid to be able to accommodate that. That's one of the faults of the current grid, which is built to have large power centers, huge utility plants, distributing electricity to everybody who needs it. We need to change that. And that requires a changing of the grid. It also means the development of what are called smart meters. Right now, your meter measures the amount of electricity that you use coming in. We need a meter that also measures the amount of electricity that goes out. They exist, but they're not very good, and we need to do a fair amount of research on doing that, as well as change the grid. And here you have a very interesting question: who's going to pay for that? Because the utilities would love not to pay for it. And so it may be, I mean, I'm not, part of me is not willing to let the utilities off the hook. On the other hand, if it needs to be done, I mean, the government might, it's unclear to me exactly what should happen. Regulations are part of it. The utilities are governed by public service commissions, and public service commissions can decide to encourage the redoing of the grid, can decide to help finance that. But that's a question that we have not really adequately addressed yet in this transition.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great response. And yeah, I thank you for that. Related to some of the things that we've touched on, like the replicating the extractivism of the fossil fuel era, and then also replicating what we were just talking about of kind of more community control regarding solar. Um, so wind and solar projects both need a lot of land, obviously. And there is a history of land grabbing.
Right, right,
So
right.
what safeguards would you say are needed to ensure that scaling up of wind and solar doesn't reinforce land grabbing, resource colonialism, and displacing of frontline communities?
Again, very good questions, and there are no easy answers to this because although on a wind farm, you can use you can use that land for other purposes. You can grow crops on it, you can put animals on it, you can feed. So it doesn't need to be totally occupied by the wind farm. But again, we need regulations to decide who owns that, who controls it. Some farmers, particularly the corporate farmers in the Midwest, for example, may be somewhat reluctant to allow such things because it requires maintenance. Some of it requires trucks to come in and maintain the wind turbines and so forth. But again, regulation is key here, and that is up to the primarily the states and the local government. But yes, it's a danger. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we live with this situation. There's a very interesting book called Fossil Capital, which raises just these issues and points out that we need some change in the regulation to avoid the same thing happening with solar and wind that is happening with fossil.
Thank you. Yeah. And then if we can't rely on the government as like right now, what do you think are the alternatives, if any?
Well, there are not many alternatives, actually. I mean, we until Trump, we lived in a country that obeyed the law. He is not doing that, and that's. I mean, I have to say, I don't mean to preach doom and gloom, but we are facing some real problems with the dismantling of the structure that I mean, there are lots of criticisms. After World War II, the United States became the leading country and in competition with the Soviet Union, obviously. But we developed a structure which benefited many people. I should point out it didn't benefit everybody. There were losers. This was neo-colonialism in part. So that there are lots of criticisms of that structure. Nonetheless, we need some international structure that allows for trade and exchange and immigration. I mean, you know, I can't believe I can believe it because it's happening. But I mean, the failure of people to understand that there are now jobs that cannot be filled because we don't have enough immigrants. There are states, New Hampshire would love to have a whole boatload of immigrants, can't fulfill its jobs at the moment. So that's the structure that we need to develop a much more communitarian structure where people can go from one country to another depending upon their economic wishes and so forth. Well, it's going to take a long time to bring that back.
Yeah, absolutely. Right there with you. Um, so this question is related. And how compatible are large-scale renewables with concepts like energy democracy, labor rights, indigenous land rights, and gender equity?
Yeah, real, really simple questions you ask, right? So, labor rights, it's key. We need legislation that supports the ability of labor unions to function. Um, as you know, as an adjunct, I'm a member of the UAW, and we, as you know, went through the huge strike to get an equitable whatever one means by that. Again, that contract was not perfect for everybody. There are a few percentage of people who lost out in that contract, but most people gained. But that's we have to protect labor rights. Unions are key to that, and we need to have regulations that allow for the expansion of labor unions and so forth. And as far as community development, indigenous rights, and so forth, we need, first of all, legislation that protects indigenous rights. That's key to that. We need to support the indigenous organizations, Narwhal and other indigenous organizations that work to protect their rights and the ownership of their land. And some of their land might usefully be used for solar cells and for wind turbines. We just have to make sure that they get the benefits of that as well as shouldering the costs so that their constituency needs to be able to get the income that is derived from solar cells and wind turbines on their land. Again, that takes regulations. It's probably going to take some demonstrations, and the environmental justice movement was born out of demonstrations by people who didn't want PCBs on their land, and they had to stand in front of the trucks and tanks that came in. That's what may be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always think about Robert Bullard at the beginning of the environmental justice
Yeah,
movement
right,
looking
right,
into um, uh, the percentage of landfills that were sited in areas that were
right, right,
largely Black and largely poor.
right.
And yeah, and how that kind of galvanized him to begin a movement. And yeah, it's really we do need resistance, and we do need people doing that research of, and connecting the dots of like the environmental racism does exist and it's
Right,
insidious.
right,
And
right, right. I mean, I do believe in protests. I wrote an editorial for the
yeah,
magazine called "Why Protests Matter," and they do matter, and they do change things. It takes some time,
yep,
but they do change things.
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you look at the civil rights movement as an example of, and as you two know in my class, it really. I'm not saying things are perfect. I'm not saying that there's not racism in the country, because there certainly is. But man, is it different than it was 60 years ago. And that's a result of movement. That's a result of people even risking their lives, going on freedom rides, going on demonstrations, being hosed by fire cannons. I mean,
Yeah,
that was not an easy job. And this is not going to be an easy job in front of us either.
absolutely. Yeah, in one of our readings, there was this really stark statistic that is stuck with me, that I think it was in 2012, 40% of the environmental activists that were killed were indigenous.
Yeah,
And yeah, it's scary at first that environmental activists are being killed, and then second that you know, a large percentage of that of those people are indigenous, which are that's the group that's most affected,
right, right, right.
arguably, in
One
many.
of the things that demonstrations do is they give you heart. I mean, they make you realize that you're not alone in this.
Yeah,
There are a lot of other people. I mean, when I participated in the March on Washington in 1963. I mean, it was just there were 250,000 people there. I mean, that
wow,
was impressive.
that's really cool. That's awesome.
That was great.
Yeah. Um, so, in terms of wind and solar, again, storage and intermittency are often cited as challenges for wind and solar systems.
Yep.
The current technological or systemic solutions to these issues, and how might they disproportionately affect marginalized communities?
Well, again, there there was a good deal of research going into batteries. Batteries are key, because you need to store the electricity when it's done in excess. Because um, I well remember when I was a young engineer working for a utility. I went out to Columbus, Ohio, which was the load center of the utility for which I worked, and there was a dial in the control room that measured the amount of energy that was being used in that area. And it happened to be the night that a fight was on, and the energy use was high. As soon as the fight was over, the energy use went way down. So energy use is key in the time between 4 and 7 p.m. But before that, the solar cells and wind turbines are able to produce a surplus of electricity. They produce more electricity than is actually used. So that has to go into storage. So batteries are one way, but there are some creative ways of saving energy. For example, there was a project in the Hudson where electricity, when it was in surplus, was used to pump water up to cliff, so that then in energy shortage times, that water could be released down through a turbine to produce the electricity in addition that was needed to fuel the economy. So there are creative ways like that of using mechanical devices to store energy. But again, we need some more research on this. The one of the key things we need to keep on doing is keep on doing research, both in some of the basic science and certainly in the technology that is going to be required. Because there are some cases, you're not going to put a battery in an airplane. It's just too heavy. So we have to learn how to make hydrogen, and also there's research going on about making aviation fuel is a very special kind of fuel, but there's research going on to use biomass to produce that aviation fuel. We're not there yet, but there is a good deal of research going on to do that. Because I have very mixed feelings about airplane use. I think people visiting other countries is a really important thing to do. You get insights that you don't get sticking in your own backyard. On the other hand, airplane travel is damaging to the environment. There's no doubt about it. So we have to be careful um, about airplanes.
Yeah, absolutely. Balancing the individual footprint versus like the benefits of exploring the world. Yeah, definitely.
Exactly. It ain't easy.
It ain't easy. Um, so you've kind of touched on this both earlier in the conversation with regards to universities and the role of universities within the energy transition and also the just transition as a whole. And then also with what you were just saying about research. But in your view, what role should universities and research institutions play in supporting a just energy
Well, I
transition?
think they're key. I am a member of the board of directors of an organization called the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences, which is an oceanographic institution in Bermuda, obviously. We just became totally acquired by Arizona State University, so we are now part of Arizona State University. I don't know if you know much about it, but it is an amazing institution. It's huge. It's headed by Michael Crow, who is a rainmaker and has written about the new American university, which he views as a university that is devoted to service to its community, not only its local community, but the community of the United States and even the world in which it lives. So they have a massive public education program. They have 85,000 students on online part-time education. And I have some questions about online education, resulting from when we were online during COVID, and I was online for a while this semester because of a fall I took. But as somebody pointed out, those 85,000 people are non-traditional students. They are women who are working and raising a family, and men who are working and raising a family, and part-time people and so forth. So they are getting an education. Crow says ASU boasts on the number of people it includes rather than the elite universities, which brag about how many people they reject. Um, so that's a model. That is a very important model because they are very much part of Tempe, Arizona, which is where they are located, and very much part of the state of Arizona and around the country. I think the institutes of higher education need to be turned around so that they are not inward facing, but they are outward facing. So they deal. I mean, the new school invented evening adult education, for crying out loud. Then it sort of abandoned that. So there are lots of models to use to involve the communities in which they serve in discussions of all of these things. And by the way, it goes beyond climate change, goes into crime production, into access, it goes into healthcare, to access to adequate healthcare. There are huge numbers of issues that universities could and should deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think universities really do have a responsibility to serve the community that not only the community that they, that are paying tuition, but also the community that are nearby. I always think about the fact that between NYU and Columbia, the that's like a huge percentage of New York real estate, and
Right.
like unless you're a part of that community, you're not really involved in that university.
By the way, you know those universities get a tax break.
Ah,
They
that's
don't pay real
yeah.
estate taxes, which is
Okay.
hugely controversial because if they pay taxes, the city would be a lot richer. But as a result of that, one can make a strong argument that they owe something to the community in which they live.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I have a big question for you. I mean, all of these have been big questions, but
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
um,
Here we go.
if you could redesign a renewable energy strategy from the ground up, what principles or priorities would you center to ensure the transition is truly just and not just low carbon?
Well, I think it would go beyond renewable energy. For example, I think mass transportation ought to be free. I think anybody ought to be able to get on a bus or on a subway or on a even a train. I mean, right now seniors get a discount, but I think it ought to be free for everybody. Um, and that, I mean, you can just imagine the number of people who would choose to use mass transportation if it were free. You know, it's getting reasonably uh, expensive. Other than that, I would give tax benefits, some of which already exist, but we need to do more tax benefits of individuals who want to put solar cells on their roof, for example, and tax credits for those people who want to insulate their home so that they use less energy in the first place. And again, I mean, this takes government involvement. You cannot avoid the importance of government in all of these activities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Um, And if you're okay with it, I would like to ask two follow-up questions
Sure.
on other things that you've mentioned. So we've talked a bit about the impact on workers throughout this transition, and like a few times during this conversation, and I would like to get your insights on what you think that transition of knowledge and of occupation entails, and kind of like how you see that playing out in the future.
You mean going from one occupation to another?
Yeah, like in terms of the workers who are that you mentioned that
Right.
are working in coal, or like how do we transition their roles to make sure that they're not out of work? Yeah.
I don't think we know how to do that yet because um, when I was at Washington University, I was invited to give a talk at a group called the East Tennessee Energy Group, which was right in the middle of Appalachia, and many of the people there were coal miners. Um, there is a cultural aspect of coal mining in addition to an economic aspect. Um, uh, Families are coal miners, children and grandchildren are coal mining. They don't know what else to do. The skills to survive in a coal mine, which are significant, by the way. You think it's just digging coal. It's not. It's a whole set of skills that you employ to save your health and to save your life. Um, they're not the same skills that you need to build a solar panel. They're not the same skills that you need to build. So that is going to be extremely difficult. And that's again where research is necessary, sociological research, anthropological research, to figure out how to make it okay for those people to not mine coal anymore. It is such a part of their life. And that's only one example. Labor unions obviously play a key role, but you know, the United Mine Workers are not in favor of abandoning coal. And they're a very powerful force, extremely powerful. And in the community, everybody is either a member or knows somebody who's a member or shops with a member. I mean, it is incredibly difficult to figure out how to do exactly that. I mean, we can put the numbers up. We can say, yes, we create more jobs than we destroy, and that is actually true. We will transition to a society which has more jobs, but they are different jobs. And labor unions are going to play a key role, and I don't think we've begun to really grapple with what that means with people who are so embedded in their current work. If we have a circular economy and a no growth economy, we will probably produce fewer cars, and many more of those will be electric cars. So the UAW, unless it is brought on board in some important way, and I don't know what that way is yet, they're going to be opposed to it, and they're going to be blocking some of the progress that we need to make. It's a key, vital question, and we've only begun to figure out how to answer it. Sorry, that's a non-answer to a really tough question.
No, no, that I mean, yeah, that I think that that's really important and it's an honest answer. It's true. So yeah, yeah. And then the other question that I had as a follow-up, it's not as related to the energy, well, I guess it is related to the energy transition, but more localized to New York. You mentioned the transition of the grid, and I know that New York State has made many claims to making the grid more
Right,
more
right,
green,
right,
more
right.
renewable. I guess just like from my personal curiosity, how realistic are those goals to reach? I'm blanking on, the exact numbers that they've committed to, but how realistic is it for them to make the transition to a fully renewable
Well,
grid
I, I,
by
I,
2030?
I, I think it's tough but realistic. I forgot to mention, I was a member of the board of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority for 20 years. And this is exactly the kind of question that we would wrestle with. Um, I think it depends in part on the goodwill of the utility industry. And in New York, I'm not a lover of Con Ed, but they do they do have some interesting research projects going on. For example, in the smart media area, they are really doing an interesting bit of research. Um, Governor Hochul has made some interesting comments and interesting statements, and I think that with a certain amount of government support, it is realistic to think of that timeline occurring, maybe not exactly when people are projecting it, but certainly ultimately, I think that, I mean, New York State has a lot of advantages. As it have as Sarah pointed out, it's got a huge university base. The State University in New York is a pretty powerful institution and can be employed to do a lot of the research as well as the community outreach that's going to be necessary for all of this to happen. So I don't think it's, I mean, as I keep saying, I don't think any of this is going to be easy, but it is feasible. It can be done.